quite happy to be here virtually. And actually, and there's second thought, the title isn't quite so accurate. We should probably actually go pull back to say Intermountain West shrublands and dryland woodlands, not just the sagebrush biome. Because, whoops, that did not work. There we go, that worked. The two examples I'm going to be talking about today is how our group uses LANDFIRE products, among other things, to address wildfire risk within the greater Great Basin, as well as a case study in the Pine Valley of Southwest Utah. For this publication that's already out for the wildfire risk in Great Basin, don't worry, you'll see that citation again. I'll have a list of those at the end. And there's this is just the first of several probably with that project. So these two examples I'll talk about are certainly quite different, diverse areas, distinct from each other, both in their extent, pretty much the entire Great Basin, including Snake River Plain, versus a single ranger district. So the scales are different. The order of local priorities is rather different. However, both share altered fire regimes, and in general, quite high risks of conversion to annual grasses, especially cheatgrass, and especially after disturbances. And while this can be really hard to address both conceptually and logistically, I hope I'll show at least somehow some amount how consideration explicitly of resistance and resilience concepts could really help with this kind of sticky wicket. Our objectives in general are somewhat deceptively straightforward. What we're presenting here is support in selecting and placing fuel or vegetation management treatments in the shrublands and woodlands that will both hopefully reduce fire risk while maintaining or even increasing ecological resilience and resistance to annual grasses. Before I march on with some more of the methods, let me quickly review the concepts of R&R, resilience and resistance, for those of you who don't think about these about every single day like our group does. Here in the, I'm not sure if I have a pointer, probably not. Yeah, anyways, the figure shows the generalized norms of how we envision resilience and resistance, how both quantities actually increase on the gradient from warm, dry, low productivity upwards along the cold, moist, and higher productivity that we observe often in association with elevation and climate. Resistance, in particular, further depends on general climate suitability for the invader and potential competitive interactions. So for cheatgrass, this generally we see that resistance increases with cold winter temperatures, as well as competition from perennial grasses and forbs. And that effect is shown in the arrows pointing down to the red, how basically presence or absence of the perennials can really help shift your expected resistance, especially. So I'm going to dive right in, since I've got two things to cover, to the fuel treatment response groups, or the TRGs. These were developed to help describe the potential for fuel treatments to reduce fire risk while maintaining or even improving the resilience and resistance across very large sagebrush landscapes. That then ties into our future decisions about data sources and our how we handled our spatial data layers that came into our study. And we define these as vegetation associations, focusing on sagebrush and Pinyon-juniper PJ, that differ in their relative inherent resilience and resistance, and that we expect to have specific responses to woody fuel treatments. We have, essentially, there are 5 sources of information that we tapped to build the TRGs. I'll go into detail later, well, in the next slide, about item 1 there, which is the dominant sagebrush associations. Then the next 2 are different characterizations of the PJ that may be present in the area. Those both relied on RAP, or rangeland analysis platform, tree percent cover, and then the LANDFIRE BpS to let us know whether an area was expected to be one that would host PJ or some other species. And then finally, the final two layers are our resistance and resilience layers that are relatively newer, climate sensitive indicators of R&R for sagebrush ecosystems. They're based on climate and water availability, especially within the soil column, that have been gridded across the entire sagebrush biome. And here I show resistance, I believe. Unfortunately, I've got the your faces are covering up the label, but I believe it's resistance. For our focal ecoregions for this particular, for the constructions of the TRGs. And you can see here then that in this case, our resistance and resilience are at 5 levels, low, moderately low, moderate, and then high and moderately high are pooled together because they are so rare on the landscape. So as I said, I will focus specifically here on these dominant sagebrush associations. Well, primarily because this is the most LANDFIRE related layer that we have. Essentially, we combined the 2016 reference database, the plot data from all those LANDFIRE plots with the extracted values of EVT, expected vegetation type, BpS, biophysical setting, and then map zones at each of those vegetation plots. Once we've got those unique combinations of EVT, BpS, and map zone, we extracted, summed, and ranked the numbers of the instances of the individual sagebrush species, top 5 shrubs, and top 3 tree and grass species. That gives us then basically a series of indicator species for what is present or has recently been present at those particular combinations of the spatial data layers. Once we had that and we brought in some additional auxiliary information about, standard climate, things like that, we then felt we had the information necessary to assign each of those kind of triple overlays, basically, to a dominant sagebrush association. And from there, final product, of course, you have to mask out all the things that snuck in that you're not actually interested in. So with those sorts of information, we derived 7 dominant sagebrush associations, and here they are being mapped. There are 4 of them that are the more big sagebrush types, and then the 3 lower sagebrush types. And as you can see, they fall out distinctively across the landscape. Probably, you have to hide this little, there we go. Now I can see my bar plots too. And in different proportions across the 3 focal ecoregions. The Snake River Plain is certainly a ecoregion of Wyoming sage, isn't it? Whereas our black sage is probably not surprisingly mostly a feature of the Central Basin and Range. Whoops, sorry, that does not move things. All right, so moving back then to the overall constructions of the TRGs, the treatment response groups. We started with a 5-way overlay of those spatial data layers, the dominant sagebrush association to source information of Pinyon-juniper, and then the 2 resilience and resistance. Smooth via sequential moving window filters, because again, we're interested in a 3 ecoregion wide area, not down to plot level. And we started with, I should have said this, we started with, I believe, 30-meter resolution as the base starting resolution. Because our R&R layer has some spatial missing points in it due to missing soils data in areas, we wanted to fill those when it made sense with neighboring values. So we used a nibbling routine to fill in those spots and then had to remask out some of the non-sage biophysical setting areas. And then finally applied a final mask to remove anything that wasn't range or a PJ area. So that gave us the vegetation assemblages. And the final step then is to assign the appropriate fuel treatments. And we had several criteria that we kept in mind while we did this. First of all, we were only interested in considering treatments that were durable. We had to expect that they would affect in a longer term, at least 10 years, post-treatment decrease in fire risk. And this was informed by a literature review, which I think is still in publication process, as well as, and which in turn was often informed by, say, for example, the Sage Step project. The treatments then also had to result in maintaining or increasing resilience, which is measured by the increase of perennial herbs or sagebrush establishment. And they as well could not decrease resistance to invasion, so that in turn, applying a treatment in that TRG should not result in unexpected increases in the invasive annual cheatgrass. So as you can imagine, with those relatively strict criteria, we ended up with a relatively small amount of the landscape that was considered appropriate for fuel treatments, but certainly not a zero amount. The largest extent was appropriate for treatments was considered appropriate for prescribed fire. As you see, nearly 41,000 square kilometers, and a lot of that being within the eastern northern basin and range. The colors kind of the oranges and pinks. More of that, the TRGs that featured PJ expansion were considered appropriate for prescribed fire treatment than those without, and more of the mountain big sagebrush regions than the Wyoming big or the basin big sagebrush. We found much less of the area was appropriate for mechanical tree removal treatments. And the vast majority of the sagebrush biome, or at least in these three ecoregions, was not assigned treatment because either of lower resilience or resistance, that's the yellow colors. And for the low sagebrush associations that lack PJ expansion, much of that was not assigned fuel treatments due to generally low fuel levels. And that would be in the kind of peach color. And then not noted there, but certainly significant are the relatively large areas, and especially in the central basin and range, where we identified potential persistent woodlands of PJ that probably shouldn't be available for fuel treatment because they are persistent woodlands.
I have a question, Jessi. Is it okay to interrupt you?
Yeah, go ahead, please. I should have said, go ahead.
So might be a question that everybody else knows the answer to, but I'm wondering about your third major bullet here, low resilience or low resistance. From what I know about this area, is the low resilience because it's already invaded by annual invasives, or I know you can't make a broad statement about all of these, but is your sense that there's no sense in doing any restorative actions there because kind of like it's too late for these areas? Or
that is a very good question. This is always, it's still tricky for me, this keeping the idea of resistance to invasion separate from already invaded. When we evaluate and assign resistance or resilience for that matter, we do not directly, it's not supposed to be a map of cheatgrass, and it isn't. It's the potential to end up becoming cheatgrass. That certainly could be expected, but it's not meant to be that. It's especially for resistance, it's meant to be conditions that are certainly where you would expect if the propagules were there, or if there a disturbance event happened, that there's a good chance for conversion, but it is not already invaded. We do actually, in a separate step, potentially, Michelle Day's project has incorporated this. We take actually large proportions of this landscape that you see here, ends up being off the table for actually proposed, we're ready to go, we're gonna do some fuel treatments. Can we go here over in this, say north of Winnemucca or whatever? And a lot of that is actually off the table when we pull in our information on current cheatgrass invasion. So that's actually kept in a separate step. First, because of the difference in the concept of what's present versus the inherent resistance, And then also logistically, cheatgrass extent changes every day, certainly every year, changes very rapidly. So is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Al. Are there any other questions on this particular aspect before I move on to the next example? All right, so I'll move on, but yeah, though you can always come back to this for additional questions. All right, now switching gears to a much more spatially restricted landscape, I'd like to talk about Pine Valley in southwestern Utah. And here we're showing the Forest Service's priority landscape, designated priority landscape, indicated in green there. So this area is, as I said, in southwest Utah, while this is while there's wilderness area and all sorts of federal land in this area, there's also happens to be one of the, in fact, is said to be the fastest growing metropolitan area in the US. And that would be St. George, just to the southwest of this map. And Cedar City is just off to the northeast, which is also a very fast growing population area. There's multiple high value resources and uses. The black dashes show the Pine Valley Ranger District of Dixie National Forest. And of course, there's plenty of BLM, private, Park Service, all sorts of things in there. And for those of you that are somewhat familiar with Southwest Utah, you might be aware how this is a combination. This is where at least three major ecoregions come together. Great Basin from, excuse me, the west and north, the Colorado Plateau from the east, and the Mojave Desert from the south. So it's super diverse. For this particular study, we take a novel approach where we start with the qualitative framework of ecological site descriptions and state and transition models, and use sources including LANDFIRE to bring quantitative information to inform our qualitative framework. Many of you are probably familiar with both state and transition models and ecological site descriptions. You know that in general, they are sometimes quite heavily detailed text descriptions, but in the end, they're texts, and sometimes, of course, the state transition models have cute little boxes and arrows and things, but, there's not much there to really help you make critical decisions. And so we're using LANDFIRE and other things to provide the quantitative information at a spatially explicit level needed to help adopt and work through the state and transition model framework. Now, for other efforts we've done, we've used things such as the soils information from the nationwide soil surveys and aim plot data, et cetera, to help inform the reference and current potential states of the ecological site description framework. But in this particular case in Pine Valley, the soil survey data is not really readily available. So instead, we turn to LANDFIRE and specifically the biophysical settings layer to inform our reference and current potential states. And I will show in detail how that worked out. And I will also, you'll see in the next slide how we actually ended up using the LANDFIRE derived, LANDFIRE related information that TNC made specifically for this region. I believe is published in 2014. So instead of the nationwide product, but the approach would also work just fine using the national product. You just have to do a little more work, I believe. And then similarly, we use various spatial analogs of degree of departure to inform the alternative states and phases at risk. So this, I do have the subtitle or the title up here says Biophysical Settings BpS for Pine Valley. What I'm actually showing is our interpretation of them as ecological types, but we didn't change anything spatially on the BpS layer other than we split out the PJ BpS into a drier juniper pinyon, which is the lighter green, kind of a really light lime green, and the moister, wetter Pinyon-juniper and the darker greens. But Otherwise, it's the same spatial data. Let me reiterate that for those who maybe don't use BpS much, this is the vegetation that could be there and perhaps was there at one point, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that's what's there on the landscape right now. However, it can serve quite nicely for being a reference. So we drilled down a bit into how these categorizations work on the landscape today. We, in this effort so far, have been using DayMet and the Global Aridity Index as some of our climate measures. We see when we look at temperature there on the upper left and precip on the lower left, that for some of these shrubland and woodland BpSs, we see patterns like you would expect as far as which ones are the hotter, drier, and which ones are cooler, and that's great. Similarly there with aridity index to the right, the higher aridity index means less arid, which is kind of weird, but that's how it works out, and we see beautiful separation. So that's was reassuring for our selection of BpS as a reference vegetation. Now I'm going to discuss a bit our indicators of departed or alternative states. We'll focus today only on the cheatgrass, annual burn probability, and PJ expansion. Other things that might be brought in include wildfire history, management actions and land use history, even some of these kind of composite or synthetic metrics such as SEI, which is Sagebrush Ecological Index, etc. There's lots of different ways you could investigate degree of departure. Here I'm showing cheatgrass and annual burn probability across the Pine Valley Ranger District. We use the USGS layer on the left for cheatgrass, and Short's sagebrush biome specific annual burn probability on the right. Because it's sagebrush biome specific only, that's why we have that big gap there in the southeast corner, which is primarily the Pine Valley Mountain range. So it's outside of the biome. But, you know, those maps, I can switch back them real quick, but the maps pretty much show you, okay, there's variability across the district, not surprising. And also seems to show you, they're not exactly the same. And when we use the reference vegetation to stratify our view of cheatgrass and burn probability, we see that cheatgrass does vary quite markedly across BpSs and probably in the pattern you might expect, but burn probably really doesn't. And another point of interest is that for those of us based in the Central Basin and Range, cheatgrass cover is kind of laughably low in many spots, but they certainly have it. It's certainly a concern. And that annual burn probability, for those who don't look at these numbers that often, that is sky high. It turns out there's a lot of fuels over in the Pine Valley Ranger District and a long burn, a long wildfire season. And yeah, those numbers are quite scary. The third thing that we are bringing in to evaluate the alternative states or degree of departure is the existing Pinyon-juniper on the landscape. Because remember, what we have so far are those BpSs, which are potential or reference, where they're more helpful when we find out potentially what's actually on the landscape right now. So we use the forest VCMQ layer, which some of you might be familiar with these things. Many forests have them. This one is, I think, like most of them, the existing mid-level database. It starts out as a polygon layer, and essentially every single stand in the forest is mapped, and there are three attributes that are of interest to us. One is the assignment of dominant species. So in this case, we pulled out everything that's the PJ dominant. Then there's tree diameter and cover from above. And they're provided in these bins that I show you. I did not make those up. And so we're calling these stand characteristics, and we argue that they'll help us identify potential recent infill and expansion. The kind of brownish orangey stuff is for the smaller trees, essentially, versus what maybe is old growth woodlands. Those would be the cooler colors, and those in this case are just indicating by the larger diameter trees. Again, let's go back to the reference vegetation. Looking at our shrublands and PJ and the composition of those as far as extent of PJ stands within them, we see that plenty of our shrublands actually have considerable amounts of PJ inside them. Some of them are the smaller stem things, so may well represent recent infill or expansion, and some others are the larger stemmed, which was perhaps the old growth. But we do have to keep in mind that, especially in this area, the low productivity sites, there could be some very old trees with quite small stems. They might just grow super slow because of the nature of the site. So field assessments are always necessary throughout, of course, to determine the true resource value of any of these particular stands. All right, we're not done with STMs yet, sorry. We just covered a few of the boxes. We still have some arrows in STMs to get more information about. So those would be the likelihood of transition and best managed practices, recovery potential, and susceptibility to invasion. All of those items can be quantitatively informed, in our case, by resistance and resilience. Now, earlier I showed you the sagebrush biome-wide R&R layers. We are developing R&R layers specific to the Intermountain drylands that use similar, but not exactly the same inputs. In this case, it's primarily climate, temperature, precipitation, and the monsoonality of the region. And we are parameterizing them to have not 5 levels, but instead to vary from 1 to 10 in a not necessarily linear approach. And so on the left, we see resilience. On the right, we see resistance. And not surprisingly, the mountains and the moister northeastern portions have higher amounts of R&R than the drier western and especially southern extent there. You can just see the Mojave Desert creeping in from the south there. And again, we go back to our reference vegetation or reference states, and we see that especially in certain shrublands and woodlands, that there can be some large amounts of variability of local R&R. And just look at that mountain big sagebrush as a good example, and Pinyon-juniper. That tells us that we would be better served if we kept in mind the R&R of the local area when we're coming up with fuel treatments. Are we going to be able to go in and run big machines around without worrying so much about the grasses coming in? Can we potentially even use some prescribed fire? Is there an understory of perennial vegetation that can take over, that can come right back and protect it? Or are we going to have to adopt a strategy of protect and defend instead? So just to wrap this last part up, we used LANDFIRE BpS to help spatially illustrate the potential vegetation and reference states, and thus visualize the ecological types. We pulled in additional spatial data to provide information on ecosystem threats, degrees of departure, and potential state changes. And we explicitly use R&R to provide information on the capacity of sites to recover following wildfire or other management actions, and the overall likelihood of conversion to that invasive cheatgrass. We do plan or have a first draft we're working on internally of an updated GTR, like the Sagebrush Pinyon-juniper field guide to the right, and as well as the accompanying spatial data products, including that higher resolution R&R layer. And of course, we're working on additional manuscripts. And so with that, I thank you all for your time, and I'll leave this up. That's got the citations for the existing publications, and I'll take any questions.
So Henry Bastian, I'm with the Department of Interior Office of Wildland Fire, serve as a business lead for LANDFIRE. So really good presentation. There's some great things that you shared with us here today. You've talked a little bit about the BpS and some, I'll call them adjustments, that you've done with those. I'm curious, based on those adjustments, whether you feel like there's more work that should be done there, especially as we look to the future. I'll put a period at that. And then as you think about those adjustments, as we think about resilience and, what's happening with climate, I'm also curious what your thoughts are relative to, making this a foundational piece and then those adjustments such that we could connect, some dots with climate, carbon, and how you might approach something like that.
So yeah, in case it wasn't clear, I mean, I'm sure it was to you, but to the folks that are perhaps not new, new to most of this, what I'm showing here is essentially a regional BpS layer that was made by TNC, perhaps Nevada. I know Louis Provencher was part of it, for the Pine Valley Ranger District. With the only change that we did was, as I said, we split the juniper, the PJ, into drier and less dry. But other than that, it's, we didn't do any spatial tweaking, and we barely changed the names. We did evaluate potentially using the national product. And we found that at this small of scale, at this fine of scale, we found that the names didn't match up in the way, the levels of aggregation were either way too coarse, is either, hey, you got some shrublands and you got some others, or you have, I don't know, Columbia Basin, blackbrush / something, something that was way too, too fine of a division for us to use. And then often say if it said, for example, Columbia Basin, and we're here in Southwest Utah, or Rocky Mountain, for example, that while we could certainly have interpreted that and done our own aggregations to come up with ecological types that probably made sense, we weren't as comfortable doing that as we were adopting this, custom-made product that the forest has been using ever since they made it, and they like it in general. Everyone agrees that this is, this version, I mean, it can be improved, sure, but everyone was happy with what had been made there for them. So yeah, I think that was was a large consideration on our part, was that, yes, we could have used a nationwide product, but it would have taken more work on our side, and it would, it was just going to be harder and a little harder sell to our collaborators. I guess a way that National LANDFIRE could help with this is to help provide some reasonable aggregation suggestions, like I said, so that we didn't have to make decisions saying like, well, these are fairly similar names, but if there's something in between, like I said, shrubland and conifers, somewhere in between some intermediate levels where you could do some logical, some logical aggregations to your scale of inquiry. And then, additionally, just, things were a little strange again when you see within this area, again, southwestern Utah, where you see BpS, national BpS names that include regions that are far flung from this area. So that was disconcerting to lots of folks who would look at the lists of what the national BpS said was there. I think, I think those are, as far as moving forward with climate change, carbon, etc. For our purposes, I think it's actually great that it's something that's envisioned to be a reference that is perhaps a little independent of changes in climate. But I understand, of course, that there's obviously a lot of interplay. So I honestly don't have a really good answer as to how to move forward with that. I will say that I didn't even get into it, but we're in the process right now that this R&R layer that we're developing, the 10-step one, we are in the process of projecting that using, I think we've settled in the world climb, I don't know how to pronounce it, but future climate projections. And we've devised it so we can just take those and step forward. And so we are planning to see what happens when we project R&R forward, but we would then still apply, I think in this time scale, because, you know, even outside of a century, you're not potentially, the reference is still quite, you know, an appropriate reference. But obviously, as you get farther away from now, that relationship will break down.
Jessi, thank you so much for your work in the presentation. I know there's a lot of work that went into this, but it felt elegant, and maybe that's the way you presented it. You know, I'll use the word elegant because it felt like things fit together and you had a great workflow and it made sense. So thank you for that. A couple quick questions and thoughts. A follow-up to Henry's. I heard some great nuance in your answer. And one word I wanted to follow up on was the suggestions in terms of aggregating BpS. Our team we're getting more and more requests to do something with BpS, the legend. And, you know, we've toyed around with the idea of, you know, our team has played around with doing some aggregations in our regions. So like Corey Blankenship, who's on the call, has done some of that work in her area. I've played around in the Great Lakes where I live. So we could do that, or we could empower users to do that by providing more information in the BpS descriptions, maybe follow along with your idea of even, you know, doing some suggested ideas in the descriptions. And I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more. Could you? Yeah, because it's something we're hearing about a lot right now. And I wanted to just follow up and see if you had any additional ideas on whether it would be more helpful for us to empower users, or would you like to see us do suggestions or us to provide like a master aggregation? Yeah, just a couple more thoughts on that. And then are your maps made in R or GIS Pro or QGIS or Python? How are your maps made?
Okay, second question's easier. It's all in R.
That's what I thought. Great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a pain at times, but you know, the reproducibility is yeah, when you can just run a script and share a notebook, it's great. I feel like I actually didn't see if Matt was on this. I know Jean is there. I don't know if she wants to weigh in on the BpS aggregation. I know, so I confess when it came to especially the previous the R&R study, the first one I talked about, I took suggestions from, I think it mostly came from the Reeves lab, but also I think Ava as well, blank on Ava's last name. I think there's already best kind of circulated best practices about like, hey, these BpSs and these map zones are the PJ ones. These are the, you know, these are the big sagebrush ones, etc. So I think users are already doing this and sharing among themselves. And you could find, for example, in the, I'll just put the citation back up, even though the map's prettier. For example, the data layers for that middle one, for the PJ one, we've got a table somewhere there saying exactly which ones we pulled in to say that this is a PJ BpS, this isn't. We have that as an appendix in there. So I think folks are already doing it. And I'm not sure I'm not sure what exactly within metadata and such that they've dug down and found that is the indicators that have made it so for them. So again, yeah, I don't.
So this is Jean, and I would just make a couple of comments. I think that when we're looking at the larger landscapes that are more consistent, like a lot of our Great Basin sagebrush systems, and where you're working with people who are very familiar with these BpSs, then it is relatively easy to understand what they're comprised of and how best to aggregate them. They're also somewhat larger. When you get down to an area like the Pine Valley, which is really transitional between what we would call maybe a Great Basin landscape, some Mojave down sort of on the southwest, and some Colorado Plateau on the southeast, it becomes really challenging because then you are looking at just multiple different BpSs and little slices of them that are difficult to aggregate. So I guess at larger scales where you have fairly consistent ecosystem types, the BpSs were incredibly helpful to us. they were more challenging when we got down into the Pine Valley and we're looking at a very diverse area.
Jessi, thanks so much for that presentation. This is Corey Blankenship. I'm a fire ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. I was really interested in your use of both ESDs and BpS. It sounded like you were taking the best information from both of those model sets and using that. And this is something that we've been interested in ourselves and talked a little bit with the NRCS folks who manage ESDs. How do we make these systems maybe a little bit more integrated and easier for users to pull from each one? Because they've got, some differences, which you outlined. So I wonder if you could share some thoughts on what would help. What could we do that would help users maximize both of these products, or just any lessons learned from that effort of using both?
Certainly the ESDs in particular, a huge improvement would have them all online and completed and easily available. That would be extremely useful. And then in some sort of more searchable format that we could pull out or have readily available, say, the indicator species, some more explicit spatial information. We, and especially Jean, have spent a huge amount of time and effort building ecological types, what we call ecological types, from basically lots of tables of where for example, I will extract either vegetation species information from either the LANDFIRE reference database, or we also maintain our larger database of AIM and FIA and SageStep and chronosequence. I've got a lot of plots that we can pull both the spatial information of what species have actually been seen there, and then pluck various climate, topography, soils if they're available, etc. But a lot of times that gets put into tables that are indexed by ecological site ID if ones are present. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer other than, having things available, searchable, updated regularly, or at least as frequently as possible. We understand that it's hard to do all this, but yeah, it's just we end up having to chase a lot of different sources in a lot of different formats, and it just becomes really tedious really fast.
It's another area where we've talked about trying to build a crosswalk, but it's a tough crosswalk because there are so many ESDs. There's that difference in scale between the two products. But I appreciate your answer. That's helpful. Thank you.
I would add on a couple of things that would, I think, facilitate the crosswalk, because the typical departure output talks about percentages, and it's a little bit nebulous, should I say. Whereas if you look at a state and transition model, you know what the states are. So when we put these together, essentially for Pine Valley, you can look at degrees of departure in terms of ecological states from state and transition models. And I think that that's really helpful to kind of pull it together. And it's a pretty easy thing to do. It just, takes a little bit of maybe simplification of those degrees of departure, depending upon what your objective is, or thinking about them in terms of what ecological state are you really in, and then how is that going to relate to a state and transition model if you really want to relate them.
We've been dabbling in mining the BpS descriptions, which are in Word, to bring information into R. And for example, it feels like a huge achievement for us, but we learned how to get the indicator species table out of Word documents into R, and can loop through several and do that. We would love to share that code with you, and I would love to learn more about how you made your plots of LANDFIRE data in R, and wondered, do you all work in GitHub, or would a GitHub repo be a good place to share code? How do you all how do you like to work, and how can we best facilitate that sharing?
Yeah, that approach could work. Also, we mostly use and our group is so small, so we just can use Google Drive or as similar as all that we do. But yeah, certainly a more structured approach would probably be better for the scale. And yes, I'd certainly be quite happy to participate in such a project.